information about that soon. So tonight we are joined by Professor Jim Hill, who comes to us as a former faculty member at CMU, but here today as a researcher and novelist who used some Clarke Historical Library resources to write his latest book, The King Must Die, The Fall of the Mormon Kingdom on Beaver Island. I will allow him to go through the book for you. So without that, I will give a brief bio. During his time at Central Michigan University, Professor Hill was professor of political science. He was director of the honors program, business law and regulation department chair, and played an instrumental role in the creation of the Robert and Marjorie Griffin Endowed Chair in American Government. Prior to working at Central Michigan, he worked in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and as a commissioner on the Michigan Natural Resources Commission. He was also a political consultant for several state and federal campaigns. And I don't know that anybody here was a student, but if you were a student of Professor Hill's, you understood that the only way to win the political game is to know the rules of the game, to be the interpreter that the rules of the game. So that sticks with some of us who took 522 at one point in life. Appreciate it. Currently, he lives in Illinois, but at the end of summer, he's making a trip through Michigan to tell us all about the Mormon Kingdom on Beaver Island and the new novel set in that time period. So please welcome Professor Hill.
Am I live? I am.
Okay.
We just stick this in here so I don't trip over it. Thank you, Brian, for that very kind introduction. And Brian was one of my students, as you might guess. And I appreciate his research assistance setting the historical framework for my new novel. He's not here now, but I want to thank Carrie Marsh, the director of the Clarke Library, and for hosting the event. And the Clarke is a gem of a piece of information about Michigan you just would never find anyplace else. And I found that through the help of Brian.
Is Frank Bowles here if I could get a chance? No, that he does.
Well, Frank Bowles was the former director of the Clarke Historical Library, and he is an institutional treasure chest of Michigan political history and politics, and a good friend. We were here, and I can't hear you, Frank. I know you're here in Mount Pleasant. I really appreciate your help, too.
It is so wonderful to see some of these familiar faces that I have looked forward to seeing for so long. I mean, it's just amazing. It reminds me of the many friendships and the many stories that I shared and we shared together at CMU. I did.
So before I begin my formal presentation of my new book, The King Must Die, The Fall of the Mormon Kingdom on Beaver Island, I want to tell you about another story, the one that led me to write this novel. Bear with me. Once upon a time, in a not too far away place, there was an island kingdom within a democratic nation ruled by a man who tried to seize leadership of a fledgling but growing religious movement.
Yeah.
Having barely become a member of that movement, he vied for its leadership when its founder was murdered. And, though unsuccessful in wresting the leadership mantle from the establishment's favorite son, who took most of the religious followers to a distant desert, he still convinced a significant number of the flock to leave the comfort of their homes and travel to a far-out wilderness island. In order to seize control of that island, he imported more of his devoted followers in order to outnumber the original inhabitants. He then declared himself king and ruled the island with an iron fist. After ruling absolutely for 6 years, he was shot by two well-known and self-confessed assassins who were brought to trial for the crime, but the murder charges were dismissed and they were both set free. Following his death, the kingdom was invaded and quickly collapsed, with all the king's followers robbed of virtually all of their worldly goods and deported en masse to faraway lands, never to return to their destroyed kingdom. The invaders quickly established a new religious order and destroyed virtually all the physical evidence of the king and his kingdom. Now, the only thing more bizarre about this story is it's true.
Easy.
And it happened in the state.
Okay.
Now, let me stop and ask, how many people here have been to Beaver Island? Let me show you hands. Look at that. Oh my gosh. All right. How many people here know James Jesse Strang?
Personally?
If you do, you're pretty old. Very good. Oh, I suspected you'd be a better informed audience than the average. Though I did have the opportunity to speak to the ultimate informed audience last week, the Beaver Island Historical Society, I decided to go to the Jaws and find out. Those folks live and breathe the island's history, and were a lively group indeed to share my novel with. So what was my personal fascination with Beaver Island? When I was director of the CMU Honors Program, I created a Beaver Island and Bead course series and traveled there with students and faculty every summer for 6 years. I became enthralled by the folklore of the island, and every summer I learned more and more about the island and particularly its Mormon history. Yet the more I read and learned from the locals and from the then director of the CMU Biological Station, Jim Gillingham, right there, the more intrigued I became about the key historical figure in my book, James Jesse Strang, the King of Beaver Island. Incredible. Now, as a lawyer and a political scientist, I was particularly curious about King Strang's assassination in 1856 and the inconclusive theories behind the conspiracy to kill him. Now, I do not have decades of research experience like those on Beaver Island who've analyzed the assassination, but it's clear to me that the whodunit aspect of the story is still unresolved. It was a story that needed to be revisited, and I decided it'd be best told as a work of fiction, as hard evidence would be needed to reopen a very old story. But my path to move from an academic writer to a novelist has not been an easy one. Upon leaving CMU and moving to Chicago, I had time I needed to try my hand at writing novels based on unsolved Great Lakes mysteries. I naively thought it would be an easy transition. But was I wrong? Why was I wrong? While the research component of novel writing was familiar enough to me to build a story, the writing style, the character development, and the audience were quite different. I had the advantage of turning to guidance from a close personal friend and former classmate who had become a best-selling author. You may have heard of some of her novels. Her name is Sue Harrison. Anybody remember Sue? I knew Sue. I grew up in Pickford, Michigan, and I knew her from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's just amazing. And she stayed in Pickford her entire life and became a best-selling author. Just absolutely amazing. Smart. Anyway, I gave her the first draft of my very first novel, which was In the Arms of Itchy Goonie, which she graciously agreed to review despite being in the midst of writing a novel of her own. She politely told me how I had a great story probing the mysterious dumping of munitions waste in Lake Superior in the 1950s. That's the good news. Then she sent me her suggested revisions, which she characterized in degrees of importance. It was 11 pages of typed single-space comments, which was a real blow on my ego. Even the order of my stories changed. She then told me how many years it took her to find an agent and finally have her first novel published. I was staggered and walked away from that first book, realizing, as she politely pointed out, that I was writing as an academic and a lawyer and not letting my creative juices flow to engage the general audience. I let that novel sit for 6 months as I pouted at my ineptitude. But of course, she was right. My past publications were scholarly in nature, slanted to a limited audience. Yet here I was, using that same writing style to express my feelings about stories I feel passionate about, but trying to do that to a much larger audience. I struggled to find a compromise between where I was as an academic writer and where I wanted to be as a novelist. My solution was to release my passion in novel form through the use of fictional and futuristic characters, without sacrificing the actual historical basis of the story. And I've used that throughout all the books I've written. One foot in the historical past and the other in the possible future was my crude operative strategy. So in my first novel, I chose a mostly unlikely protagonist, a Native American woman from a tiny town in the Upper Peninsula with no interest in politics. I used her absurd climb to political power to highlight the holes in our existing electoral system and the frailties of our democratic institutions. A year later, I finally finished a wholly rewritten second draft of that first novel, and 11 drafts later, finally got published. It was a good feeling to have done this, but I discovered that writing one novel was not enough. I did not want to be a one-trick pony. And I had learned so much from my first novel, so I published 2 more over the next 3 years to complete what I called my Gitchy-Goomy trilogy. My creative juices were now flowing, and with the King Strang story still bouncing around in my mind, I decided my next novel would take on a different Great Lakes mystery, the rise and fall of the Mormon kingdom on Beaver Island. My novel begins with a very brief overview of the key historical figure in the story, James Jesse Strang. By the way, his original name was Jesse James Strang, but that's another story. To fill in the details of the tale I started this talk with, Strang was an ambitious man who converted to Mormonism only 5 months before the Mormon Church founder, Joseph Smith, was murdered in 1844. Yet Strang vigorously vied with Brigham Young, the person we usually associate with the Mormon Church, for the leadership of a growing Mormon religious movement in the 1840s. Though unsuccessful, Strang was still able to convince a small but significant number of highly devoted Strangite Mormons. I call them Strangites. You had Brighamite Mormons and Strangite Mormons. To follow him from Illinois, where I live, to Wisconsin, and finally to the wilderness of Beaver Island, where he had himself crowned king in 1850 and ruled absolutely from 1850 to 1856. Now, what do historians say about King Strang's rule? Let me read from my book a passage from my novel, and you figure out who they are described. Besides the true believers who were convinced Strang was divinely ordained as their prophet, there are 2 schools of thought by historians about Strang. Supporters of the red-bearded Strang point to his unusual personal background and compare him to a famous future president. Listen carefully. Quiz at the end. Both Strang and this president were self-educated men who became lawyers, born on farms, voracious readers, experts on quoting passages of the Bible to support their causes, talented debaters and speakers with a sharp wit. Okay, now we're getting really close here. Served as postmasters and legislators. They both supported black suffrage and opposed the Fugitive Slave Act when it was unpopular to do so during this pre-Civil War era, and both were assassinated. Figure out who that one is, okay? Now, what other and most historians describe Strang as? Most other historians have a different view of Strang. They compare him to another well-known president. Both Strang and this president were obsessed with fame. Indeed, Strang had visions of marrying Queen Victoria. Both men, once they came to power, were intolerant of dissent, had an insatiable need to grab more and more power and use their political position to punish their perceived enemies. had delusions of being gifted beyond all other humans, had many legal skirmishes at the state and federal level but were never punished for their actions, were feared by their opponents who knew that the slightest questioning of their authority would bring in an over-the-top adverse response, were not afraid to distort the truth rather than admit error, voter fraud was alleged in their elections, and they constantly used political scapegoats to justify their authoritarian actions and pursue goals that benefited them more than the people they were elected to represent. Let it go at that. In today's politics, there is much discussion about kings. A federal judge wrote, disapproving of the recent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that the court had created for the first time a kingdom within a republic. Democrats in Congress introduced legislation entitled the No Kings Act in response to the court's decision. Protesters carried signs proclaiming No King since 1776. It's as though we never had a king since the American Revolution. We did. Nothing. The Mormon kingdom on Beaver Island and the history of this anomaly is not something commonly analyzed or even discussed in polite company outside the Beaver Island environs. Indeed, those who know this history still quibble over whether Strang was really a king. In my new books, I have a CMU professor, not me, Professor Conley, and his attorney friend, Gordon, and they addressed this issue of whether Strang was really a king. Gordon, by what authority could Strang declare himself king? Professor, well, technically, he declared himself to be king of the Mormon church on Beaver Island, kind of like declaring himself to be head of a church, which he certainly was, as spiritual leader of every Strangite on Beaver Island. Gordon, but he really wasn't a king as we know the term today. Professor, well, the word king began as a church title, but it grew to a secular title as well, as Strang expanded his authority and imposed Mormon laws and new codes of conduct on all island residents. He also instituted a tithing requirement for his followers who held lands on Beaver Island, taxing the remaining Gentile, and that's what we use to define non-Mormons or Gentiles, remaining Gentile landowners as well. Before long, with his combined spiritual and secular authority, he possessed a king-like authority and actually crowned himself king in a special ceremony celebrated each year, until recently, as King's Day, July 8th. The few remaining Gentiles, non-Mormons, and critical Strangites who resisted his kingly powers soon were pushed off the island, making his power absolute. Gordon, and no one objected to this power grant? Professor, one scholar describes Strang's political strategy not as a power grab, but a simple but deliberate path to absolute power. Listen to this quote, it kind of rings true. Strang looked out at the frontiersmen and farmers who had flocked to his side and came to a decision. These simple democratic people could not, he knew, be converted to dictatorship overnight. They would have to be prepared for it, led into it, step by step. Those of you who have visited Beaver Island will still have observed the vestiges of this kingdom. You've traveled down King's Highway, remember that? Hearing stories about July 8th being King's Day, landing on a ferry at the only town on the island, which was named for Strang, St. Ken. Yeah. Much has been written about the history of Strang's grip on Beaver Island and is beyond the scope of this talk. But in my new novel, the CMU professor's challenge was not resolving the often conflicting views on the details of Strang's life, but the vague assessment of the plot to kill him and the unanswered questions about the role of his enemies, who likely participated in a conspiracy to assassinate him. So let's begin with what we know factually about this actual assassination attempt that occurred on the dock of St. James on June 16, 1856. The opening scene of the novel describes a U.S. Navy warship. A U.S. Navy warship on Beaver Island in 1856. Amazing. docking at the St. James Harbor on that very day, and the captain sending his pilot to fetch King Strang and bring him to the vessel to discuss business. The pilot and Strang began their short but deadly walk to the dock in the prologue of my book, which I think basically sets the stage for this. Strang was so distracted that he failed to notice an unusually large number of men congregating on the porch of a store close to the dock. Nor did he notice the grim look on their faces, expressions which appeared neither respectful nor submissive when in the presence of their king. More importantly, he didn't see two men follow them as they walked towards the ship. Gazing at the warship, Strang was impressed by the colorful backdrop for their meeting. Navy blue uniformed men gazing down from an armed warship and a highly decorated captain in full dress uniform awaiting him at the top of the deck ramp. All this pageantry against the backdrop of a large U.S. flag flapping gracefully in the wind, which was in stark contrast to the diminutive Strang, dressed in austere black clothes and standing on a primitive wooden dock. Now, this one sentence is one I added because I just thought it did just kind of fit. He wished he had at least worn his royal robe and even his crude crown to compensate for this visual imbalance of authority and pageantry. I think he's fought back. That's just me throwing that in there. But I get to see him say, all this, and I'm the king, and I'm here in this black outfit, staring up at everybody, looking at me, making me look pretty small. Now, fully focused on the captain, Strang began to release his arm from the pilot, just as two men drew near to Strang with loaded pistols. A boy in the dock spotted the two men now rushing towards him and shouted, "Brother Strang, men are coming to kill you." But before Strang could react, the two men discharged their pistols at point-blank range at Strang, with one bullet striking Strang in the back of the head and the other in the middle of the back. Strang grabbed the pilot's arm as he fell forward onto the dock, but not before he lifted his head to see who had the temerity to strike their king. The two men were fleeing to safety on a nearby U.S. Navy ship, right there at the dock, after the shooting, but seeing the king's head move, they realized he was still alive. They ran back towards him, with one assassin shooting him again in the face, and the other beating him over the head with a horse pistol until the pistol broke in two. I mean, talk about a tough bird. Satisfied that they had completed their mission, a battered and limp Strang now lying face down on the dock in a pool of blood, the two retreated to the Navy warship to escape the expected Mormon retribution. Yet, no one who witnessed the shooting lifted a finger to stop the assassination. Not the sailors on the ship, nor the men on the nearby porch who witnessed it all. And the ship surgeon examined Strang and declared his condition hopeless. But questions were still remaining in light of the tumultuous events that immediately followed Strang's shooting. Now, who else was likely involved in this rather elaborate assassination plot? Professor Conley identifies who historians believe were the likely suspects beyond the two assailants in the assassination conspiracy. They ranged from disgruntled Irish fishermen and displaced Gentile local government officials to the governor of Michigan and the president of the United States. Also add angry excommunicated Strangite Mormons and even the loyal ones, upset by the repressive and unpopular laws Strang imposed after assuming absolute power. Historians in the past have described this diverse group of potential conspirators in some detail, but have done nothing to describe how this elaborate conspiracy came together. Consider the scenario. An armada of armed men from other islands invade Beaver Island
and within days after Strang's death, round up and physically remove every Strangite Mormon from the island. So who among this group organized this massive act? Who financed it? Who arranged for ferries to forcibly transport hundreds of Strangite Mormons to other states? How did this elaborate scheme take place with the poor communications in the 1850s? Who coordinated sending armed posses to sail in from Mackinac and St. Helena Islands? Spontaneity is too simple and convenient to answer, and detailed conspiracy explanations are woefully inadequate. So the question remains for our CMU professor in my book, not who participated in the plot, we know who did, but rather who masterminded it. Let me cite from my book one example of the unanswered questions involving just one prominent conspirator, the big guy, the President of the United States. The professor from my book. First off, I'm puzzled by the role of U.S. presidents in the assassination that you asked about earlier. It's public record that President Millard Fillmore, you hear that name very often, ordered Strang arrested and tried in Detroit in 1851, but Strang was acquitted. It is also believed that President Pierce, another of those people you don't hear very much, ordered or at least did not object to the USS Michigan, the Navy warship, docking in St. James Harbor on the day Strang was shot. So both presidents were not only aware of what was going on in Strang's kingdom, but also took steps to address the political threat he posed. Gordon, so what's the problem with that? No one disagrees with those facts, right? Professor, historians don't disagree with the facts, but they have failed to explore the depths of U.S. government involvement in the assassination conspiracy. I mean, think about it. The Michigan warship docks at Beaver Island for the second time in 1856, but it only makes one stop a year in all the American ports on the Great Lakes. And this second stop happens on the day Strang is assassinated. The Michigan captain summons Strang to his ship, and Strang is shot while attempting to board, but no one on the warship tries to stop the assassins. The captain allows the two known assassins to come aboard his ship, refuses to turn them over to Beaver Island Mormon authorities, waits overnight to allow the families of the assassins and other prominent anti-Strang authorities to aboard the ship with their belongings, and then transports them from Beaver Island to Mackinac Island for a mock trial. Gordon, well, putting it like that, it sure sounds like the U.S. government was a key player in the assassination. So why wasn't the issue pursued? Professor, historians like facts and direct evidence.
Yep.
What happened on Beaver Island certainly pointed to some kind of U.S. government involvement, but who? Was it direct White House involvement? Was the captain acting in his legal capacity, reflecting his personal dislike of Strang? Was the captain bribed as part of a larger conspiracy? The issue has laid there like a wet noodle, with nothing more than vague insinuations and no further research. Gordon, why do you think that is? Professor, maybe it's because we historians are too narrow and fact-based in our methodology and too unwilling to speculate politically, fearing the national fallout if we accuse a past president of ordering the killing of one of his own citizens based on only circumstantial evidence and theory. That part of these papers there. Also left unexplained in the shooting, I got to go back to it, I'm sorry to sound gory, but the killing Strang just sticks in my mind. Also left unexplained in the shooting was how a mortally wounded Strang could survive 3 weeks after this horrendous wound. After being shot twice in the head, once in the back at point-blank range, and then beaten unmercifully over the head with a pistol, he did not die in the dock. In fact, he even lived long enough to be shipped to Wisconsin.
Shouldn't sleep. Let's sleep.
He eventually died 3 weeks later, but even the details of his death
on merging. And I've gone through the Clarke this historical articles. I've read the Northern Islander. I'm trying to find details about his medical care. It's not there. The day before he died, and this is something many people don't know, the day before he died, his health rallied. His head wounds healed. I didn't know head wounds could heal. And then the next day, the day after King's Day, he reportedly suddenly wilted and died. 2. A strange survival and collapse medical story bordering on a miracle, considering the lack of medical care, knowledge, and hygiene of that era. Now remember, almost a decade later, President Lincoln was shot once in the head and barely survived the night, and surely had better medical care than Strang. However, the professor in my novel found that little is known about Strang's medical care as well, and was puzzled by how Strang could die so quickly after seemingly rallying from his wounds. All right, now we come to the fun part. The professor, the university problem. Despite all of these unanswered questions, in 2036, and notice I put it ahead, so we're not talking point fingers at anybody here. This is 2036. The professor, relying on the research of past historians and his analysis of the political motivations of the known conspirators, proceeded to write what he believed was the first complete picture of the King Strang assassination conspiracy. He was excited, anticipating the prestige and fame that would come to him from his highly anticipated new book. He chose to ignore the many loose-ended questions that he had, since there was no hard evidence to contradict what he wrote. After its 2036 publication, he discovers an obscure but unsettling piece of evidence that does not fit neatly into his new book, raising the suspicion that the conspiracy circle he described in his book was incomplete. Now, he got a lot of pressure from the university. This is 2036. Remember, we're not fingers it. And other external political figures to ignore his misgivings. But the professor set aside his personal interests and pursued this new clue in a twisted journey that threatens his reputation and his liberty, leading him to seek to exhume the remains of King Strang 180 years after his burial, in order to convert this clue into hard evidence most historians seek. I encourage you to follow the professor's unconventional research journey in my novel, so I will leave out those details and his startling conclusion, so as not to spoil the story for those who have not yet read the book. But in researching the assassination, I gained some valuable insights into the consequences of Strang becoming an absolute ruler in the New Kingdom, as he quickly moved to control the everyday life of not just his enemies and non-believers, but his devoted followers as well. Let me give you some examples. He imposed an unpopular bloomer clothing requirement on all women. Anyone remember what bloomers are? They were not popular, but Strang required everyone, not just Mormon women, every woman had to wear bloomers. He conveniently reversed his position on polygamy. Now remember, when he was duking it out with Brigham Young to be leader of the Mormon church, Brigham Young was a believer in polygamy. Strang said, I don't believe it. But after he obtained absolute power, he reversed his position. And in the process, ended up with 5 wives and 14 children. He imposed a law of consecration that was used to seize the property of all of Strang's opponents. And he imposed an era of suppression of all dissent, even by loyal Strangites, severely punishing even the mildest disagreement. And by severely punishing, one person died, others were whipped. It was not a mild punishment. But even more startling was the broad scope of revenge that the invading Gentiles imposed on the Strangite Mormons after they killed Strang. All Strang-eyed Mormons were not only dispossessed of their property and most of their worldly possessions, but they were forcibly evicted from the island and dispersed to other states they didn't even know. The Mormon religion was totally replaced by Irish Catholics, who took control of the island and made it the Emerald Island, as it is known today. And justice for Strang's killers, confessed assassins, was a joke. Let me read one example of this justice. Following the drop-off of the families of the assassins from the Navy warship to Gentile legal authorities on Mackinac Island. Now, mind you, there was no internet, and the only daily newspaper north of Grand Rapids was Strang's own Northern Ireland. Yet the conspirators and their family were greeted by cheers at the dock. The assassins were not confined to jail and were given all the comforts they needed. And when the assassins, who freely admitted they shot Strang, were brought to trial, it took less than an hour before the case was dismissed. The only penalty they faced was a $1.25 fine for court costs. And there's no evidence they even made that. Not a peep from the governor, not a peep from the legislature. Gordon, Kangaroo Court. Professor, it would appear so, but no one probed how this all transpired so fast and why a clear-cut attempted murder case could be so blithely dismissed. It's as though this was all prearranged, as the assassins seemed to have no fear that they would suffer any legal punishment for such a foul and premeditated deed. I mean, who told the crowd to wait for the show? If you've been to Beaver Island, since a 2-hour ferry ride anyway, why did the court dismiss the case so quickly? And why were the assassins not confined or punishment? It seems incredible that this all happens spontaneously unless, Gordon says, unless what? Unless someone in advance graced the wheels of justice and provided assurances to the assassins that they would be taken care of. This forcible dispersion of the entire Mormon population from the island and the lack of legal accountability for the killing of their king is mind-blowing. In summary, yes, we had an American king. The Beaver Island Kingdom history confirms what Lord Acton warned. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is a fictional story, but one filled with true historical facts, meant to highlight the still unresolved questions about the scope of the plot to assassinate America's only crowned king. I hope this novel not only piques readers' interest in a true historical event, barely mentioned in contemporary literature, but also encourages writers and scholars to continue to explore the roots of this conspiracy. Such a research effort may require looking not merely for the smoking gun evidence that we all want to find, but analyzing more obscure and nonetheless important clues to find better answers to the assassination conspiracy. And the Clarke Library is the ideal first step in such a research journey. It is a treasure trove of original documents waiting to be dissected. I hope you enjoyed the CMU professor's futuristic journey exploring the great northern Michigan mystery. My new book can be ordered on Amazon and other major book sites for delivery on September 15th. Sorry, it's not there yet. But I brought some advanced copies for those who can't wait. I hope there's a few of you. Or those who want a signed copy. If that's it. But I want to open the floor to questions. There's so much about this story that I can't talk about in a short period of time. But questions about King Strang and his kingdom for those who seek to probe what was described as one of the most disgraceful events in Michigan history. So I will open the floor for questions if you have some, and I would be happy to respond. But I guess, Brian.
And if you have questions, we'll bring the microphone around. I have heard that the St. Clair County Library System is purchasing a book for checkout. Because I got an email today about it. So check your local library, too.
Good for that. Good choice.
Thank you. How did Strang enforce his rules? Did he have a strong police force? Or did the people just willingly follow?
Well, he had his Illuminati. people who have sworn fealty only to him and not to God. And there were at one point there were at least 135. So he had the mob to be able to make sure that people comply. And these people were the ones who would take people out who didn't wear bloomers. Oh, by the way, if the women didn't wear bloomers, the women didn't get punished. They whipped the husbands. In fact, one of the killers of Strang was that husband that was whipped. Just for fun. Go ahead. Do you have another question?
Yeah, so were any of those people his police force around when he was killed, or were they just out there?
That's a really good question. And this question was asked in Beaver Island too, and I thought, that's a really good question. Why was he all alone? And the answer seems to me that because he had so effectively quelled all dissent and thrown off the island all his possible killers or whatever, I think he felt that he was just basically indestructible. If you read the first line of my book as it starts off with a quote of what he says in his sermons many times: "Bullets will never pierce my body." And that was one time I think he was wrong. I know. Questions? Get one right down here.
Invalid.
By the way, I when I was on Beaver Island, I heard stories that I didn't know about. But one of the things was that Strang, when he wanted to baptize people, had a deck built 3 inches below the water, so that when he wanted to walk out to baptize people, it looked like, how about that? I thought that was, I never heard that story before. That was told to me by the director of the Beaver Island Historical Society. So I think it was one of those fun days. Good. So,
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Can't wait to get the book.
yeah.
Your book has now breathed another 50 to 100 years of light into the Strang story. I cannot believe that, and many people can't believe that this story has stayed with us this long, for 150 years. Just about a decade ago, a scholar from Salt Lake City for another comprehensive study of Strang. And I'd like to ask you, the question is, what do you attribute before your book? How did the interest stay so common and continue to go on and on? There must be 30 books written on it.
Yes. Boy, that's a really good question. It is. I honestly believe, and this is me speaking as a professor and not as me, that's just that is saying top of my head. When you go to publish something, it's so much easier to get something published if you are consistent with what the major thinkers believe. And it is so difficult to get something published if you try and tell people that everybody was wrong and you're right. So we find ourselves oftentimes when we're seeking tenure, that rather than fight the people who are saying, you don't know what you're talking about, you kind of praise the other people and you find a little smidgen more to say that to get that article published. So I think what's happened is that when Strang was assassinated, by the way, they had a 7-volume, the people of Beaver Island wrote 7 volumes on the history of Beaver Island, and they all wrote stories about what they saw. And they basically created a scene that most historians then drew upon. So all of a sudden, you've got a biased situation of what people perceive to be the situation, and then anybody saying that's wrong, well, it's not true. So I guess my answer to that is, I think that it takes someone to step out of line and make the case and be ready for the heat. And when I was talking about evidence, Petoskey stones. If you look at Petoskey stones in the water, you can see them. There they are. If you look on the shore where they're bleached, it's hard to discern. And I feel like we historians are looking for the Petoskey stones in the water.
And we're not looking on the beach where something else might be. And maybe if we picked up that stone and put it in a hole, we'd find something rare. And I guess that's what I'm saying to all of these stories that we think are closed, or everybody says this is the answer. I don't think that's the case. I think we have a world of possibilities now. I think we can take any story, and if we're willing to dig deeply and probe deeply and look for that unconventional evidence, I think we can have some amazing stories that maybe we've been taught in folklore of what the case is, and find out that's not nearly true. And I think, as someone who gets excited about history, I think that is the most exciting thing for me. And King Strang's story is just one of those mysteries. And there are so many in Michigan. I mean, if you look at the Great Lakes mysteries, there are stories, and people have gotten a conclusion. They've closed the book, and you can pry it open if you're willing to probe. So, sorry, didn't mean to talk so long.
See here about that.
Good.
So, I actually have a couple of questions. Also, the 14 children, certainly they must be ancestors still around. And then the other question is, this is like over 20 years after statehood. Was there nobody in Lansing hearing what was going on? Have any concerns about that?
In response to your second question, he was elected to the state legislature too. So, and he managed to carve out his own political power in Lansing. So he neutralized Lansing by his power there. So that was his way of saying, I'm king of Beaver Island, and I'm also a powerhouse in Michigan. But your first question was what?
The 14 children.
Yeah. When you read my book, you'll find that one of the things that they tried to do is exhume the grave of Strang 180 years later. Strang was buried twice. He was buried first in Boree, and after he died, his estate was sold, and a Gentile, non-Mormon, bought his property and was so ticked off at Strang that he put a pig farm on the grave and had pigs walk across the grave and piss on him and crunch him just to let it happen. So after 20 years of this, Strang's daughter, Mirette, found the money to exhume his grave and bury it in Burlington, where he would not be trampled on by pigs. So yes, there are. But the real trick about getting that exhuming was that under Wisconsin law, if you want to exhume a grave, it has to be a living relative directly descended from the deceased. So you had to find somebody who was willing to do this. Well, this is the professor in 2036. This is 180 years later. There's nobody alive from that period that can do that. And so the backbone of this whole thing, when the professor decides, I got to prove that this is Strang's grave, was he had to go out and find some way to do this. And that's part of the legal part of that. That's something that John Riggleberg might enjoy his books too. So does that answer your question?
Sure. Yeah.
Anything else?
And for the descendant question, there are still individuals who are Latter-day Saints, Strang followers. There's still a Strang cluster in Wisconsin.
Yes. A small group, but they're still there.
So Jim, why did you decide to do historical fiction as opposed to just a more traditional history?
Because I wanted to encourage people to do something more. I could repeat what everybody else did, and the Clarke Library is a wonderful treasure trove, and I've read everything I can possibly on it, but I'm not adding anything to it. I'm only repeating what other people have said and maybe adding a few fringes. So I thought, how do I trigger these questions that aren't answered? How do I trigger this? And the way to do it was to say, all right, let's throw in a clue, a fictitious one. Let's throw in a clue and watch them spin this off and see what happens. And maybe that will be the basis for people to say, you know what? Maybe we need to rethink that Strang assassination. Maybe we need to think about King Strang as someone who was killed by someone greater than our assassins. And that's why I did it. And I whether it catches, I don't know, but I felt the need to get that off my chest. It was.
So I saw that we had a couple hands. So we're going to go 1, 2, and 3, and then the rest of the questions we'll do down at the reception, where you can get your book signed while you're at your questions.
Hi, Liz.
And Jim, thanks. What about Mormon theology in the story? Was this man a godly king or a secular king?
And
It's one of those most difficult questions in the world to answer. And I guess I'd start with this. His background before he became a Mormon. He was a fraud. He was an atheist. He was a Baptist. And then all of a sudden he became a Mormon. And at the moment that he became a Mormon, he immediately began plans to take over the movement because he came from the New York Burnt District, the upstate New York, where religion was burning hard, and he burned out his welcome and moved to the Midwest. But the stories about him are such that I think Miles Harvey wrote a book about the confidence man, that this was all part of a plan of his, that he wasn't real about it. But I gotta think, and this is just my personal opinion, so I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I think that after a while, he thought he was divinely appointed. After a while, even though he had created all this bogus material, I think he thought, the island is mine. No one who contests can leave me alone. I am the absolute power. And I think at the end, that's why he was walking down that dock. No one's going to touch me because I'm the king. So I guess my thought process is that I think he began as someone with a seedy background. I think in the end, I think he convinced himself that he was more than just a con man, that he had God's touch, and he was there to bring God's kingdom to Beaver Island. And he did it in an iron fist way. Yep.
What's your favorite fun fact about Strang or about his rules?
I think I think the graveyard. I think that when somebody is so ticked off at you that they would buy your grave and then put a pig farm over it just to drive you into the ground, I think that is the absolute utmost get even that I've ever seen in my life. So for some reason I thought, God, they must have hated him. That's a bit bad. But that just rings in my bell. Rings my bell. The other thing though, when you look at this picture of King Strang, something that has fascinated me is time and again, everybody says that his key power were his eyes. That he had penetrating eyes that could convince anyone. It wasn't just his voice, but he had these eyes, and they seemed they were like piercing eyes. And there's a color photo, I think, at the Beaver Island Historical Society. They have a wall that better shows it. But I got to just say, I gained a great deal of respect for the Mormons because of what they have gone through. I mean, Joseph Smith, their founder, was in jail, and a mob came and killed him, and nobody punished him. King Strang was shot on a dock in front of Navy people, and nobody stopped it. The Mormons have suffered a tremendous battle. Now, whether you believe in Mormonism or whatever you believe, it's not about the religion. It's the fortitude of these people. I mean, the fact that they would leave Carthage, Illinois, and go across the desert and go to Utah and set up a quasi-kingdom there. It's just amazing that they've been able to survive in an environment where people were unwilling to give Mormons the right to live. It just kind of strikes.
And we're going to have our last question before we head out.
Yes, thanks.
I'll tell you.
I guess the quasi-kingdom that we're talking about with Brigham Young, he kind of, the only reason they let him stay to simplify it, was because he brought people into a desert no one wanted to live in. And, Young, he kind of, he compromised with the U.S. government on a few things. So did Strang have a like an end goal in mind, like in the future I'm in U.S. government or state government, I have these people. Was he trying to import more people? Was he trying to expand, or just become kind of just a little pocket trying to hide his own people in?
An excellent question. No, he did have a plan. He went to the President of the United States. Brigham Young was named governor of the Utah Territory. And Strang tried to negotiate to replace Brigham Young with him as head of the Utah Territory. He was, and they were, mortal enemies right up until his death. So I definitely think Strang thought big. Strang was not I want to marry Queen Victoria out of joy. He thought, I'm royalty, I can do this. And Brigham Young was the only person that defeated him, and he was going to defeat Brigham Young. And I might add, if there ever were a sequel to this, if ever there were a sequel to the story, it would be, what if Strang had survived? And the reason why I pose that question is, Strang's basis for arguing he should be head of the Mormon church was that he felt he was divinely appointed. So he made the statement in all his sermons, I can't be killed. What if he's shot twice in the head, once in the back, and survived? If I were Brigham Young, who did not claim divine intervention to become leader, if I were Brigham Young, I see him as a bigger threat than the federal troops who moved to Mormon and tried to unseat him. So yes, I think there was a bigger plan, and that's why I think this event, which is just a little footnote in history, could have changed the entire Mormon religion, and really could have. And like I said, Strang is a pretty, flexible. I'm for monogamy, but until it's not convenient, now I'm for polygamy. He was a flexible enough person, but I'm just curious where the Mormon church would be today if Strang had replaced Brigham Young. Don't know. But thank you all very much.
So thank you all. We invite you down to the Clarke Historical Library just down the hall here for some refreshments and some more talking with Professor Hill and others. And again, we have another talk in just a few weeks with Professor Duggan from Wayne State talking about the other Cinderella.